Let me tell you about a morning that changed everything for a man who thought he had already weathered the worst storms life could throw at him. Picture yourself sitting in the plush leather chair of a corner office 47 floors above the bustling streets of downtown Seattle, where the smell of fresh coffee mingles with the faint hum of servers and the quiet clicking of keyboards from the open workspace beyond the glass walls. This is where our story begins, with a man named Dmitry Volkov, who 23 years earlier had arrived at JFK Airport with nothing but a worn duffel bag, a computer science degree from Moscow State University, and dreams that seemed as impossible as they were necessary. But isn't it strange how the very success we chase can sometimes become the trap that ensnares us? The morning sun cast long shadows across Dmitry's mahogany desk as he reviewed the quarterly reports that showed his company, Neural Flow Technologies, had just crossed the billion-dollar valuation mark. His fingers, calloused from years of coding through sleepless nights in cramped apartments, now traced over profit margins that would have seemed like fairy tales to that frightened young man who once scrubbed dishes in a Brooklyn diner just to afford ramen noodles for dinner. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire on artificial intelligence and machine learning, technologies that could predict human behavior down to the most minute detail, yet he never saw coming what was about to unfold in the next hour. How could someone who had mastered the art of anticipating the future be so blindsided by his own past? The first sign that this Tuesday would be different from any other came at precisely 9:47 a.m., when his executive assistant Sarah knocked on his door with an urgency that made the coffee in his mug ripple like a small earthquake. Her usually composed face was pale, and her voice carried a tremor that spoke of something far more serious than a scheduling conflict or a demanding client. "Mr. Volkov," she said, her words carefully measured but barely concealing her anxiety, "there are some people here to see you. They say it's official business." The way she emphasized those last two words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, because in his experience, nothing good ever came from official business, especially when you were a man whose accent still carried the weight of a homeland that many Americans viewed with suspicion. What kind of official business could possibly require the kind of urgent attention that had drained all color from Sarah's face? Through the glass walls of his office, Dmitry could see them before they even entered. 3 individuals in dark suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, their eyes scanning his workspace with the methodical precision of people trained to notice everything and reveal nothing. The lead agent, a woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, extended her credentials with a kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she had done this countless times before. "Mr. Volkov," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "I'm Agent Martinez with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We need to speak with you regarding some discrepancies in your immigration status." The words hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly the air in his climate-controlled office felt thick and suffocating, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out through the ventilation system. How could there be discrepancies in his status when he had meticulously maintained every document, filed every form, and paid every fee for over 2 decades? The next few minutes passed in a blur of legal terminology and procedural explanations that seemed to echo from a great distance, as if he were listening from the bottom of a deep well. Agent Martinez spoke about routine security checks and recent policy changes, about the need for additional verification and the importance of national security, but all Dmitry could hear was the thundering of his own heartbeat drowning out her words. His mind raced back to all those nights he had spent hunched over his laptop in his first apartment, a studio in Queens where the radiator clanged like a percussion section and the neighbor's television bled through paper-thin walls, coding applications that would eventually revolutionize how companies processed data. He remembered the pride he felt when he received his first H-1B visa, the relief when his green card finally arrived, and the overwhelming joy of becoming a naturalized citizen 15 years ago in a ceremony where he had wept openly as he recited the Oath of Allegiance. If all of that meant nothing now, what did anything mean at all? "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning," Agent Martinez continued, her words cutting through his reverie like a blade through silk. "This is standard procedure, but I must inform you that until this matter is resolved, your access to certain sensitive materials and locations may be restricted." The implications of her statement began to sink in with the slow horror of watching a building collapse in slow motion. His company dealt with government contracts. His employees had security clearances, And his entire business model was built on the trust of clients who needed to know their data was in reliable hands. How could he explain to his board of directors, to his investors, to the hundreds of employees who depended on him for their livelihoods, that their CEO was being investigated for immigration violations? The thought of their faces, the mixture of disappointment and betrayal he might see in their eyes, made his stomach churn with a nausea that had nothing to do with the untouched breakfast sandwich growing cold on his desk. As they prepared to escort him from the building, Dmitri caught sight of his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he had come to love and call home. The man staring back at him looked older than his 51 years. His hair more silver than black now. His face bearing the lines that came from decades of responsibility and stress. But his eyes still held that same determined spark that had carried him through his first brutal winter in New York, when he had walked miles through slush and snow because he couldn't afford subway fare. His breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he promised himself that someday, somehow, he would build something that mattered. That reflection seemed to mock him now, a reminder of how far he had climbed and how far he had to fall. But wasn't there something almost poetic about the way success could make you vulnerable in ways that poverty never could? The elevator ride down from the 47th floor felt like a descent into hell. Each floor they passed marking another step away from the life he had built and toward an uncertain future that terrified him more than anything he had faced since those early days of struggle. His employees watched through glass conference room walls as the group passed, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern that would undoubtedly give way to rumors and speculation within the hour. He could almost hear the whispered conversations that would start before they even reached the lobby. Hushed theories about financial impropriety, government investigations, and the kind of corporate scandals that destroyed reputations overnight. The young programmers who looked up to him as a mentor, the marketing team that had worked tirelessly to build the company's brand, the security personnel who had trusted him with their careers. What would they think when the news leaked, as it inevitably would? How do you maintain the respect and loyalty of people who discover that their leader, their inspiration, might not be who they thought he was? In the back seat of the government sedan, watching the familiar streets of his city blur past the tinted windows, Dmitri felt the weight of every immigrant's deepest fear settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. It didn't matter that he had paid more in taxes last year than most people would earn in a lifetime, or that his company employed over 800 Americans, or that he had donated millions to educational programs and veterans charities. When you were born somewhere else, when your first language wasn't English, when your name required people to pause and think about pronunciation, there was always a part of you that remained foreign, always a sense that your place in this country was contingent rather than guaranteed. The American dream had seemed so solid, so permanent when he was living it, but now it felt as fragile as morning frost, ready to disappear at the first harsh touch of reality. Was this how it always was for people like him? Forever guests in someone else's house, no matter how much they contributed to the mortgage payments. The ICE field office was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, all fluorescent lighting and beige walls that seemed designed to drain hope from the human spirit. As he sat in the waiting area, surrounded by other individuals whose stories he could only imagine, Dmitri found himself thinking about his daughter Elena, who was finishing her sophomore year at Stanford, studying environmental engineering with a kind of passionate idealism that only 20-year-olds possessed. She had been born in America, had never known the uncertainty that had defined his early years here, had grown up believing that this country was as much hers as anyone's. How would he explain this to her? This sudden reminder that the ground beneath their feet had never been as solid as they had believed. What words could possibly convey the mixture of shame, fear, and indignation that was currently tearing him apart from the inside? Agent Martinez led him into an interview room that could have been lifted from any crime drama. White walls, metal table, 2 chairs, and a recording device that hummed with mechanical indifference. The questions began immediately. A relentless barrage of dates and details that stretched back decades. When exactly had he entered the country? What was the purpose of his initial visit? Had he ever worked without proper authorization? Had he ever failed to report a change of address within the required time frame? Each question felt like a surgical probe, designed to uncover some long-forgotten mistake, some minor oversight that could now be wielded as a weapon against everything he had built. The strange thing about memory is how it can play tricks on you when you're under pressure. Suddenly he couldn't remember if he had filed his address change form when he moved from Queens to Manhattan in 2003, or whether he had reported his brief consulting work for that startup in 2007. Had these details ever mattered before? And why did they suddenly feel like matters of life and death? Hours passed in that sterile room, and with each passing minute, Dmitri felt himself becoming a stranger to his own life story. The agents dissected his past with the methodical precision of archaeologists, turning over every document, examining every timestamp, questioning every transition from one status to another. They spoke about him in the third person even though he was sitting right there, as if he were already an abstract case file rather than a human being with hopes and fears and people who depended on him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a frequency that seemed designed to induce madness, and the coffee they brought him had gone cold hours ago, leaving a bitter aftertaste that matched his growing despair. Outside, the sun was setting over a city where his employees were probably working late to handle his absence, where his investors were likely making phone calls and contingency plans, where his reputation was slowly crumbling with each passing hour of uncertainty. How many empires had fallen not through dramatic conquest but through the slow erosion of confidence, trust, and time? Just when it seemed like the questions would never end, when Dmitri had begun to resign himself to the possibility that his life as he knew it was over, Agent Martinez's phone rang with a shrill urgency that cut through the monotony of the interrogation. She answered with her usual professional demeanor, but as the conversation progressed, something in her expression began to change. The rigid lines around her eyes softened, her posture shifted from aggressive to uncertain, and she began glancing at him with something that looked almost like confusion. "I see," she said into the phone, her voice losing some of its earlier authority. "Yes, I understand. We'll need to verify that immediately." The pause that followed felt like an eternity, and Dmitri found himself holding his breath without realizing it, as if the very act of breathing might somehow influence whatever decision was being made on the other end of that call. What kind of information could possibly change the trajectory of an immigration investigation in the middle of an interrogation? When Agent Martinez hung up the phone, the silence in the room was so complete that Dmitri could hear the hum of the building's electrical systems, the distant sound of traffic on the street below, and the rapid beating of his own heart. She stared at him for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of genuine surprise beneath. "Mr. Volkov," she finally said, her voice carrying a tone he hadn't heard from her before. Not apologetic exactly, but certainly less hostile than it had been all day. "We've just received some additional information that requires us to reassess your case." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, as if she were walking through a minefield of bureaucratic protocol and personal bewilderment. "It appears that your company's recent work on predictive algorithms for homeland security has been flagged as critical to national defense infrastructure." But what could that possibly mean for him personally? And why did her expression suggest that she had just learned something that changed everything? The explanation that followed was both simple and extraordinary in its implications. 3 months earlier, without his knowledge, neural flow technologies had been quietly classified as a critical national security asset due to their development of AI systems that could predict and prevent terrorist attacks by analyzing patterns in social media, financial transactions, and communication metadata. The Department of Homeland Security had been using their algorithms to successfully identify and prevent 6 separate terrorist plots, and the FBI had integrated their technology into counterintelligence operations that were currently protecting American interests around the world. The irony was so profound it was almost laughable. While ICE had been investigating him as a potential security risk, other branches of the same government had been relying on his work to keep the country safe. His immigrant status, which had seemed like a liability just hours earlier, was now complicated by the fact that his deportation could potentially compromise ongoing national security operations. How could the same government simultaneously view him as both a threat to be eliminated and an asset to be protected? Agent Martinez excused herself to make another phone call, leaving Dmitri alone in the interview room with his thoughts and the growing realization that his life had just taken another unexpected turn. Through the small window, he could see the sun setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the sunsets he used to watch from his grandmother's apartment in Moscow when he was a child. His grandmother, who had survived Stalin's purges and World War II, had always told him that life was like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing toward some destination that remained hidden until you arrived there. She had never lived to see him leave Russia, never got to witness his success in America, but he wondered what she would make of this latest twist in his improbable journey. Would she see it as proof that he had finally found his place in the world, or as evidence that he would forever remain caught between two identities, two nations, two versions of himself that could never quite reconcile? When Agent Martinez returned, she was accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Deputy Director Richardson from the Department of Homeland Security. His presence transformed the dynamic in the room completely. Suddenly the ICE agents were deferential, almost apologetic, and Dmitry found himself being addressed not as a suspect but as a valued partner in national security efforts. Deputy Director Richardson explained that there had been a communication breakdown between agencies, that his investigation had been triggered by routine background checks that failed to account for his classified security clearance and the sensitive nature of his work. The words national asset and critical infrastructure were used repeatedly, and Dmitry realized that his immigrant status, which had seemed like such a vulnerability, had become irrelevant in the face of his contributions to American security. But even as relief washed over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this entire experience had revealed something fundamental about the precarious nature of belonging in a country where you weren't born. The drive back to his office took place in a government car with tinted windows, but this time Deputy Director Richardson sat beside him, briefing him on security protocols and discussing the expansion of his company's contracts with various federal agencies. The city looked different now, more familiar and foreign at the same time, as if he were seeing it through new eyes that had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, belonging, and the arbitrary nature of fate. The young man who had arrived at JFK Airport with nothing but dreams and determination had believed that success would make him safe, that achievement would earn him a permanent place in American society. But today had taught him that safety was always temporary, belonging was always conditional, and even the most successful immigrants lived with the knowledge that their place in this country could be questioned at any moment. Was this a lesson in humility, or a reminder that the American dream came with terms and conditions that were subject to change without notice? By the time they reached his office building, the evening shift was just beginning, and he could see lights still burning in the windows of his company's floors. His employees were still there, still working, still believing in the vision he had shared with them and the future they were building together. As he rode the elevator back up to the 47th floor, Dmitry thought about the story he would tell them, the careful balance he would need to strike between transparency and reassurance, between acknowledging what had happened and maintaining the confidence they needed to continue their work. The reflection in the elevator's polished doors showed the same face he had seen that morning, but somehow it looked different now. Older perhaps, but also more aware of both its vulnerabilities and its strengths. He had built a tech empire by understanding patterns and predicting outcomes, but life had just reminded him that the most important patterns were often invisible until it was almost too late to recognize them. What other patterns had he missed? And what other surprises might be waiting in the complex algorithm of his American story? The elevator doors opened onto a floor buzzing with activity, where his employees looked up from their workstations with expressions of relief and curiosity that told him the rumors had been flying all day. Sarah approached him immediately, her professional composure intact but her eyes showing the strain of managing a crisis she didn't fully understand. "Mr. Volkov," she said quietly, "the board called an emergency meeting for first thing tomorrow morning, and there are about 30 reporters who've been calling for comment on some story that's apparently breaking on the financial news networks." He nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning of another phase in his ongoing transformation from immigrant dreamer to American success story to national security asset. The phone calls would need to be made, the explanations would need to be crafted, and the delicate work of maintaining confidence in his leadership would need to begin immediately. But wasn't there something almost liberating about having all his cards on the table, about no longer having to pretend that his success had made him invincible? As he settled back into his office chair and looked out over the city that had given him everything and almost taken it all away in a single day, Dmitry realized that his story was far from over. The immigrant who had built a tech empire had survived his worst nightmare, but in doing so, He had discovered something even more valuable than financial success or professional recognition. He had learned that true belonging wasn't about having the right documents or the right accent or even the right achievements. It was about contributing something essential to the place you called home, something so valuable that it became impossible to imagine that place without you. His algorithms were now protecting American lives. His innovations were strengthening national security, and his company was creating jobs and opportunities for hundreds of families. The boy from Moscow who had dreamed of making a difference in the world had finally found his answer to the question that had haunted him for decades. He belonged here not because the government said he did, but because America needed what he had to offer, and he needed the freedom to offer it. The phone on his desk rang with a familiar tone that meant Sarah was connecting an important call, and as he reached for it, Dmitry smiled for the first time since that morning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions from the board and the media, new conversations about security and transparency and the complex realities of running a company in an age of global uncertainty. But tonight, as the lights of his adopted city sparkled below and his employees worked late to keep his dreams alive, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and why you deserve to be there. The American dream hadn't been what he expected. It had been harder, more complicated, more fragile than he had imagined, but it had also been more real, more meaningful, and more permanent than he had dared to hope. And isn't that the most beautiful thing about dreams that survive contact with reality? They become something even better than what we originally imagined, something worth every moment of doubt and fear and uncertainty we endured to make them real.